Okay, well, it is 7 o'clock, so we can get started. I'm sure we'll have some more attendees trickling in, but welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this session. I'm Anna. If you've been to any sessions, you're probably tired of hearing me give the same spiel at the beginning, but I'm the coordinator for the online teacher program, and I'm also a year 2 teacher candidate at Western. And today we have Colin, and Colin is the director of the Child and Youth Development Clinic, and he's going to be providing some insight on some strategies for the best practices for supporting students and children with anxiety. So this will be helpful for all educators, all divisions, strategies that he's going to be giving. So without further ado, first of all, just ask your questions to the Q&A button. If you look at the bottom, there should be a Q&A button. It might be at the top for you. If you want to also send your questions to the chat, that works too. Just make sure that you select to all panelists and attendees. If you don't have it saying and attendees, then none of the other attendees can see it. And it's really helpful for everyone to kind of build off each other's questions. So just make sure you have that setting enabled. And yeah, without further ado, welcome, Colin.
Hey, no, well, thank you, Anna, for the opportunity, and thanks for the Faculty of Education for letting me know about this initiative. This is a great opportunity to connect with educators and to share some of our ongoing work and see what conversations and community we can have from this. So really excited. So what I'll do is I'll pull up on my screen here, and hopefully everything works. Yeah, so again, thanks for the opportunity tonight, and I think on my end, the hour's going to go by quickly. I'm sure I could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about this topic alone. But my hope really for tonight is that we can leave with some initial ideas about how we might be able to take some of the ideas, what we know from research and evidence, and to apply that with your educators about how we might be able to use some of these cognitive behavioral therapy ideas, knowing that we're not therapists, but to be able to support students in our classrooms. So I'm going to be providing an overview of anxiety in children and youth, and really looking at some of what we know around the best evidence base to date about reducing anxiety, to think about how we can inform these strategies, again, that we can be applying in the classroom, and really to think about some of our next steps to support anxiety students with anxiety or might be displaying anxious symptoms there. So maybe just as an introduction, I'll talk a little bit just about how we know anxiety disorders are one of the most common forms of mental health problems. So when we're thinking at the level of difficulty, when we're thinking about anxiety disorder diagnosis, we're thinking about 6% of children and youth at kind of any one time. But I really want you to think kind of beyond anxiety disorders and really think about some of the kids who maybe aren't quite at that threshold, but are really struggling. So I think about kind of the analogy of kind of the tip of the iceberg. If we have anxiety disorders really at the top of that iceberg, but really all those kids kind of underneath who are also struggling. And that really shows up in some of the data. So one stat here, 2017, longitudinal study being operated from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, Ontario's Student Drug Use and Health Survey, surveying students from grade 7 to grade 12 and asking them about their mental health and well-being, how they're doing at school. And you can see some of the stats there, about 40% of students indicating moderate to severe psychological distress, about 1 in 5 students rating their mental health as being fair or poor, and about 30% reporting elevated levels of stress or pressure. And these are all kind of pre-COVID markers there. So I'm sure what, thinking about the current kind of status of kids and youth, we know those numbers from some of the surveys done recently are going to be kind of much higher than that. So we have a large proportion of students who are really struggling with their mental health, and we know they're at school. I guess before we get really into it here, I want to make a bit of a distinction in between what we're often talking around anxiety and kind of more stress. So when we actually talk about stress, more typical or expected stresses, it really does have a different experience compared to anxiety. So I think about stress as being kind of productive and mobilizing. It's getting us going, right? So there's perhaps a little bit of stress coming in here tonight, but I was at my computer early. I was making sure PowerPoint, the technology was working. And it's rather specific. It's really gathered around the particular demand or stressor at that point in time. So it's time limited. And we're thinking about some of our students, that we're supporting in the classroom, it's often kind of age matched, where if you kind of did a survey in the classroom, a lot of students might be feeling anxious or stressed about a particular situation. Right? Perhaps it's end of January exams for students. Perhaps it's around social pressures. Again, it's often kind of normative compared to where students are at age developmentally. But when we're thinking about more anxiety that's problematic or getting in the way rather than being kind of mobilizing and getting us going, it really has the reverse. So we feel that it's quite paralyzing. Rather than being kind of manageable, it feels uncontrollable. It becomes quite pervasive. Rather than being about one thing, it starts to kind of become about other things. And again, when we're often talking about problematic anxiety, when those stressors have kind of been eliminated or have gone, that anxiety is still there. So it becomes kind of chronic over time, or age mismatch compared to kind of a lot of youth. So again, that's just kind of a bit of a distinction that I've been kind of making as we're, because we often use those words interchangeably, but they really do kind of mean often different things. And we know that anxiety problems really do have kind of a complex origin story that way. There's lots of different ways to end up being a youth who might have elevated levels of anxiety and being really struggling. And we do know that for a lot of kids, there's a strong genetic component. And that's where the role of temperament. So if perhaps from Psych 101 days, perhaps, you might have seen the videos from Dr. Jerome Kagan, the developmental psychologist, looking at how young infants are reacting to different stimuli. Infants that are several months old, and he shows them a mobile or a balloon, and you can see some temperament differences of how even young kids are reacting to that. You see some kids who are cooing and wanting to explore, or really curious about that, and others who are turning away in distress, feeling overwhelmed by that. So again, even at 6 months of age, you can begin to see this blueprint about how they're experiencing the world, perhaps differently compared to their peers. And that's what some of the research shows, is that some of these kids are really kind of turned into threat in a way that some kids aren't. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's a picture there of my oldest when he was quite young there, so I don't know if he looks anxious there or not. But again, just to know that right from kind of day one here, that we have a bit of a marker of how kids are experiencing the world. So what you end up having is, again, these kind of differences over time where you have kind of the same stimulus or situation and kids reacting it in kind of very different ways. Right, so there's my oldest, we were at Home Depot, I think it was pre-COVID, about 2 years ago, right? Halloween decorations are out, and oh, that's cool, let's get a picture of that, right? Really interested in that. And for my youngest, not so much. Again, kind of same stimulus, and you can see how perhaps his makeup and how he experiences the world is quite different there. And I won't have time to get into tonight, again, kind of some of those complex origins and pathways, but we know there's different background factors, parental factors, over time, how we're supporting those anxious responses that can help shape our skills about managing anxiety. But really what I'm going to be talking here tonight are really some of these foundational pieces about cognitive or thinking expectations that anxious kids often show in different situations. Talk about some of the anxious behaviors that they're displaying in response to that perception of anxiety or threat. And a little bit around the fear response. So again, those physiological feelings that are setting off those false alarms for kids in these anxious situations. So I will be focusing on kind of those three, which really form the basis of, on my end, working with kids clinically, cognitive behavioral therapy. So maybe I'll just kind of pause at this point, perhaps kind of through the chat feature, just to really kind of, I guess, pose a question to you just about what does anxiety look and sound like from your classrooms or your experiences, what you've heard perhaps from other educators or team members. Just wondering if you can perhaps in the text box there, share a little bit about what does that look and sound like in our students. What might you be seeing or hearing from kids? What might be some of those signs there that you're wondering about or curious that maybe anxiety is getting in the way? Wonderful. Yeah, so some great ideas here. So it can kind of feeling kind of jittery, perhaps kind of on edge. A lack of participation, withdrawn behaviors, that's a real hallmark sign. Being risk adverse, not taking those kind of chances as part of that. I'm seeing some comments there to kind of no eye contact, turning away, feeling shut down, that freeze response, panicking, talking quickly, getting out of those situations. And great here as well. I'm glad that some people are commenting here about being agitated and acting out as well, because we certainly see that there's some of those kind of more classic internalizing kind of difficulties. Again, that often that if I think about the 3 F's, the fight, freeze, and fight, freeze, and flight there as part of that. It really does capture kind of all of those different kind of behaviors there. So great job, because I think that's really does capture that whole continuum. Just go to the next slide here. Perfect. Yeah. Some other concepts are trouble breathing, some of the jitteriness. There we go. And I think you've got a lot of these kind of already, right? Some of those fear of new situations, that refusal to join in or try, work avoidance or risk avoidance. Some of those physical complaints, so not due to health, but right, those kind of sore tummies or butterflies, perhaps before going to school or sharing at class. Excessive worrying, that excessive reassurance. So this is not just kind of, Colin, curious about a question and seeking clarification. This is reassurance that really goes beyond answering problems or answering questions, so that they continue to need that reassurance that that they're okay, or perhaps that they're on the right track, or that things are being managed. Frequent bout of tears, which is great, I saw there. And at the same time, you already captured there some of that kind of agitation, that quickly becoming oppositional or irritable. Often educators I'm working with will talk about things escalating really quickly. They're kind of from 0 to 100 really quickly. It's like a lights switch there. And when you talk with some of these kids, they talk about not being able to kind of let things go. When we ask them to, talk about some of their thinking, they really describe these black and white thinking patterns. I either aced the test or I completely failed it. There's nowhere kind of in between, that gray zone. And some kids will actually talk about, I just can't get these thoughts out of my head. They won't turn off that way. So great job getting kind of that whole continuum. And so what I'll be talking about tonight are really some of the adaptations of strategies from what we know around kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT for short, we know is a very active experiential form of therapy. It's really focusing on building and practicing. So really focusing on that skill acquisition and generalizing it across settings. And really in our research today, it's really the most strongly supported intervention. So it really is kind of the gold standard at this point for what we know. And it really is about involving some of those 3 pieces there that we looked at on the slide before, about looking at how our thinking and perception of a situation influences our actions or behaviors, and ultimately how that's affecting how we're feeling in a situation there as well. And we'll go through a lot of examples about that. So what I'll be talking about tonight are really kind of some 4 main themes here of strategies. Again, using this kind of as a foundation. Again, the job here is not to, my goal is not to turn you into therapists. There's enough responsibilities I feel on the shoulders of educators, but really to use some of this CBT informed application. How can we find some of these opportunities and skills where we can promote and reinforce some of these skills, which we know are strongly supported by evidence? And the first one that we're really going to talk about here in our classrooms is really to be able to validate the experiences of kids, students, to normalize their experiences, and to begin to externalize that. We'll talk more about that. So the first one is really about being able to talk about children and youth about and stress in our classroom. It is really such a normative experience for lots of us, and it may not show up at school for all kids, but I think for a lot of us, we can identify times when we felt uncertain or stressed or anxious about different scenarios. And one of the great things I really like about that is that we can begin to kind of separate the child from their experience by externalizing some of that anxiety stress, rather than it be about Colin and all the difficulties I'm having, or maybe some of the behaviors that are getting in the way. We can talk about Colin's stress or Colin's anxiety. How is it getting in the way for you? How's it making things more difficult? And to really talk about that as kind of a classroom experience. And I think that's one of the great things that I've seen from a number of different organizations about the first 10 days and the first month of coming back to school from COVID, is to talk about this difficult and unusual space that we're all in right now, to make room for those difficult feelings or emotions and talk about what that's been like. And really, that is so validating for a lot of kids to hear that I get it, I understand difficult for you, and let's talk about, I know it's not you, I know it's the anxiety that's perhaps kind of really getting in the way there. So this is one example, again, then working clinically with the kid, but we began to externalize his worries, and we actually gave it a nickname. So I've got a couple of rules for this. One is that it has to be a clean name, right? So a name that we can say in the class or with parents, hockey coaches, things like that. So for him, we named it kind of Mr. Freezy, because he had a real kind of freeze response to anxiety there. So we can, we don't need to necessarily give it a nickname, but we can talk about how anxiety is getting in the way, or give it kind of a fun, humorous name. Because again, once we're able to do that and separate that, we can then be on the same team with the child. It's myself and the kid versus Mr. Freezy, who's really getting in the way and making life difficult, perhaps at school. As part of that, I think it's really thinking about what those opportunities are around kind of connecting, to be able to listen, reflect back, validate. And the last part is really about the regulation side, right? We know that showing up is half the battle, and being intentional kind of around that. So this is just one visual we use for kids around their self-regulation levels. Right, here you can see at the end here, the speaker is about to blow, so that's probably not the time to be having a reflective conversation about how things are going. But perhaps it's kind of earlier in the day, perhaps it's kind of a quieter moment where we can begin to kind of talk about, again, how anxiety is getting in the way for them at school, and what that's like and how tough that is. So really thinking about those specific opportunities to talk and debrief, and what we know is that it's often not in the moment, right? That's when our feelings, our brains being overwhelmed, all that cortisol and stress and emotion, kids are not available. But when we can find those quiet moments, or perhaps it's the day after or away from that difficult experience, maybe we can talk about that. We also use different resources. So this is Chester the Cat from Anxiety Canada, but there's a whole wealth of really books focused on social emotional learning right now. So again, this is Chester and how he experiences anxiety. And you can see all kind of those behavioral observations, perhaps, again, those kind of butterflies, shaking legs, some of that jitteriness. Kids will often complain sometimes of having headaches, or I just can't talk, or going red because they're embarrassed about that. Again, just another kind of clue and kind of foot in the door to help kind of make connections with kids and families about, maybe you've got a sore belly, but I also wonder if it's perhaps some of those worries really kind of getting in the way. And we talked about those kind of three components there, about how our thinking influences our behavior and actions, and how that influences our feelings, and how I guess powerful that is, that at kind of any one time, how when kids are really struggling with anxiety here, to see when anxiety is really kind of calling the shots here, how tough that is for kids. It's because they're getting it from really kind of all sides, right? They're getting those physiological feelings that are saying kind of danger, danger, alarm. Anxiety is having that perception about that there's danger or threat, or you can't manage this. And of course, we're going to be feeling in the moment to try and get out of that situation. So we're often really providing a lot of empathy for kids about, geez, I totally get it. If I was feeling like that, I think I'd be having the same difficulties, or it'd be really tough kind of there as well. Great, and there's a great question in the chat there about principles of acceptance and commitment therapy. So maybe I'll kind of circle back around to this, if that's okay, perhaps just a little bit later on there, Anna, because I think that's a great question.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, perfect. Yep, so again, one example here, and again, there's lots of different kind of great books that can do this, right? I'm in my bed at night, I hear a noise at the window, just as an example, right? Anxious kids get this right away, right? The anxiety a burglar, there's someone breaking in. And of course, if that was the perception, the thought that we're having, of course, we're going to be feeling scared, right? We might be running to our parents' bed or checking the alarm, looking outside. When the most likely scenario is that it's, trees or the wind or at our house, raccoons. And of course, if we're having that thought and that perception, we're going to be feeling a different feeling because of that. And again, the power here is how our perception and appraisal of that situation can influence, again, how we're feeling and ultimately how we can respond as well. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on this slide because I think this is one of the most powerful ones just of the presentation. I think that really talks about how anxiety develops and is maintained, but ultimately what we can do as well to help reduce anxiety. So think about here as an example of a child, perhaps that has to do a presentation at school. Again, we know that's a common worry for a lot of kids. It's a book report, and perhaps kind of 1 week to the presentation, we're kind of feeling okay. But as we're getting closer to that presentation day, some of that anxiety is starting to increase. Perhaps it's the night before, perhaps we're having breakfast, perhaps we're getting ready to get dressed to go catch the bus, and it's feeling really difficult, it's feeling really uncomfortable for kids. And often, again, if anxiety is calling the shots, what anxiety wants to do is to get rid of that uncomfortableness, right? Is looking for a way out in the sense of trying to escape or avoid some of that symptoms. Because anxiety is saying, boy, if you're feeling anxious now, just wait till you're at school, or just wait till you're doing that presentation. You won't be able to cope. You won't be able to manage. So we might see perhaps at that moment a child, of physiological symptoms going on, telling their parent, I can't go to school, I'm sick. So again, perhaps they might stay home that day. And what we often see is that shortly thereafter is that anxiety levels drop and kids are feeling kind of much better or much more comfortable. And that's not to say that we can't all have kind of, I think we've all had moments when, I can't deal with that text right now, or that friend, or I can't think about the assignment that's due, or the lesson plan that I have to prepare for later on this week. I can't do that right now, right? And that's totally okay. That's part of just kind of being adaptive, kind of coping. I think where anxiety starts to call the shots is when we get stuck in these loops here, where kids are feeling anxious and uncomfortable, and by avoiding or taking a detour around some of those symptoms, they're not getting that experience of being able to manage or habituate, which is really just a fancy term for saying kind of our body getting used to that sensation. And often the analogy I'm using here is about jumping into a cold pool, right? At first, kind of it feels really overwhelming, and our body's, saying, get out, get out, get out. But if we can stay in that cold pool, swim around a little bit, dunk our heads, suddenly things seem to feel a little bit easier. And it's not that anything's changed at all. No one's jacked up the heater, no one's at the back dumping in buckets of hot water so that our body's gotten used to it. And that's really, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do through on the professional side is help kids get over that hump there, knowing that, again, this is the difficult part. It's not going to be easy, but knowing that over time with practice is that we're going to make it down here, is that it's going to feel more manageable. It's going to feel like something we can do over time together, and not get stuck in that, because that's such a reinforcing cycle of, again, being anxious, avoiding taking that detour, and feeling more comfortable. So I know that I went through that kind of pretty quickly there, but again, that's in a nutshell. And some of the responses there in the Q&A were great about kind of absences, not participating sometimes, being risk avoidance, where they all often follow that pattern of experiential avoidance around these difficult feelings. And often, what we're often trying to do together as teams, when some of my own experiences working as a school psychologist at schools with educators and parents, is often one question we're often trying to pose and trying to figure out is why is that feeling kind of so tough at that moment? So just as one example here, difficulty understanding, importance of understanding the why. So this is a child who's kind of missed multiple days of school in the past 2 weeks, who's anxious about going back to school. What could be some possible reasons there why this child doesn't want to go back to school? So maybe just in the chat there, if you could just kind of post just a couple of ideas. What are they worried about, or rather, what's anxiety worried about for this child? Any ideas there? Great. Yep. So not keeping up in class. Absolutely. That's kind of a big one. Wondering about how they're comparing to their peers around kind of progress that way. I think about perhaps kind of social worries, perhaps worried about their parents, yeah, about bullies, stress of assignments, yeah, participation, all great ideas there. And that's wonderful because it really a whole host of different worries there that might be getting in the way. And that's where having a better description of what anxiety is worried about is going to be really helpful. Because again, our kind of plan here is really going to be dependent on perhaps kind of some of the worry and how we might be able to, how we're going to be able to respond there. So again, you can see the whole different range of possible kind of worries. And there's a great quote here that I love from Mel Levine that talks about kind of a more detailed description will lead to a more informed prescription. And again, not prescription medication wise, but a prescription around how we can help, how we can build kind of some of those tools in our toolbox to help support kids. So this is one just worksheet we use and as part of our work here. And again, as part of that initial kind of beginning to hone on and what is anxiety kind of worried about? And one of the great things about anxiety is that it tends to be quite predictable. So once we kind of know its playbook, once we know the soundtrack it's going to bring out each and every time, we have a pretty good sense of what might be getting in the way. So you can see the child here on the right-hand side with the purple marker here, some very different worries, being away from home, parents going out, nighttime, possibly around that theme around separation anxiety. Whereas the child here on the left with the orange marker might be much more worried about a whole range of different things, perhaps kind of more in that generalized anxiety camp or side of things. So again, kind of knowing our enemy, knowing our anxiety bully or worry is going to be really helpful as we think about next steps. The other pattern here, and again, thinking about kind of tool number 2, is really about these different thinking strategies. We know, going back to kind of the C around the triangle there of CBT, is we know that the thinking patterns, anxious thinking is often what we call the engine of anxiety, right? It takes us from this present moment right here, right now, when we're kind of doing okay, and is taking us way down the road there to a zombie apocalypse future when we're not able to kind of cope and the world's falling apart. Right, it takes us again on a fast bullet train there from the present to kind of a future. And what we often know is that anxiety is predictable and that it often follows a lot of kind of anxious thought patterns that we can actually begin to take a step back at and really kind of look at. And again, on the clinician side, we talk about this helping kids develop a more realistic cognitive appraisal of the situation or stimulus. And again, we're not asking educators to be therapists, but I think there's a lot of parallels here with a lot of the problem solving that you're doing on day to day with students, whether it be kind of math related or showing your work or thinking on other pieces that fit so nicely in around that. And when we talk about kind of developing skills, I really do see this as kind of a thinking skill. And on the caregiver side, so parents, caregivers, we know that there's often that tendency to dismiss a lot of those worries, right? Oh, you don't need to be worried about that, or you know you're going to be fine. I told you again, yeah, everything's fine, right? And that's a natural response, but what we're kind of doing in those moments is really missing some opportunities to build some of those thinking skills. To say, hey, you know, here's what anxiety is kind of saying is going to happen. Let's really kind of put that to the test. And we know that, again, anxiety is predictable. There's often a lot of different kind of unhelpful thinking or anxious patterns that stick out. Catastrophizing is a big one, right? It's not just didn't do well on that test. It's I've completely failed. And because I've bombed my grade 6 EQAO, I'm no longer able to go to university, right? And I've heard that from some real anxious kids, right? Is again, it goes from this present moment, maybe didn't do as well as I thought, and a future reality where they're not able to cope. Jumping to conclusions, taking little pieces of evidence and really running with it, overgeneralizing that. And I talked a little bit about some of that black and white thinking. And we can often hear that in the what if statements from anxious kids. So the idea here is really to kind of take that step back to examine it and say, again, that's, one reality, that's what anxiety could, is saying. So maybe that could happen, but what's kind of the evidence for that? What other things could happen? What's the best thing that could happen? What's the most likely thing that could happen? What's happened when you've been worried about before for these types of situations? How many times has this thing actually happened that we're kind of worried about? And as part of developing that, to land on a more realistic or kind of helpful thought about that situation. So, this is one that I really love here. Again, you're asked to give a talk in class. This anxious child is saying, everyone's going to laugh at me. That's anxiety saying that. The more realistic thought is it's going to be over soon. And I really love that because it's not that, I need to love doing this. It's not that I'm going to excel and it's going to be amazing. This is a really helpful. It's going to be over soon. Maybe it's uncomfortable, but I can manage it. So I love that as a more helpful or kind of realistic reframe about that kind of situation. And this is when I'll be providing the links here at the end as some different tools and resources around this. So this is one that comes from School Mental Health Assist, now called School Mental Health Ontario, where as part of their educator toolkit around everyday practices, really some different strategies that you can use. And what I love about this is it's really front and back talking about these different activities that we can do in the classroom to be able to kind of reinforce and promote some of these skills. And again, this one specifically around some of that realistic thinking and feeling there. And again, it's not that we're kind of immune to this, right? We all have those situations from time to time, whether it be a glance from a colleague or perhaps kind of not doing our best, and those anxious thoughts might get away from us for a little bit, and then we need some of our friends or supports to say, hey, I know that was tough, I'm sure you kind of did fine as part of that. The third one here, again, kind of the 3 of the 4, is really now focusing on that behavioral piece. And perhaps we'll have some time for questions kind of around this. Is we know, again, going back to kind of the visual we talked about before, being able to kind of be in those situations, those feared, tough situations over time, will weaken anxiety. And at the same time, taking those detours, those escapes in the moment over time will strengthen anxiety. And what we know from some of the best research to date around evidence-based programs is that idea of exposure and giving kids the opportunity to be anxious in some very personalized, gradual amounts over time is really such a key to effective treatment. And that's where some of that collaboration with parents and other professionals who might be involved is really key to figure out how can we find that just right level of practice for kids, again, to kind of come down that other side of the curve. And that's where that personalization, that graduated plan is really going to be tailored to kind of each child. And again, going back to why kind of knowing some of the why pieces can be really helpful. So I love Gary Larson here because it really talks about the situation that we're often kind of faced, and not only on the educator side, but for parents, right, is feeling that, okay, we're going to go in and this is going to be, you're going to do the presentation and there's going to be tears and it's going to be miserable for everyone, or we're going to stay at home and maybe there's some temporary reprieve for the child, but parents aren't feeling good about that either. And often kids aren't either because they want to do this. It's anxiety that's getting in the way. So what we're proposing as part of kind of our work and the collaboration is being able to introduce that third door. Because we know, again, this is, my kid going to gymnastics, screaming and crying, or us kind of moping at home because we didn't go. And that doesn't feel like a right choice either. So the idea here is about, again, finding that kind of just right level. Some of the collaboration with kids to be able to figure out, what is that level that kind of feels right kind of for you. And that collaboration with parents is really key about that, to figure out, what's our kind of entry point. And going back to the cold pool analogy, we don't want to find the hot tubs because kids are already doing different things at school, participation-wise. At the same time, we don't want to be finding the really cold pools, right? We don't want to be doing the polar bear dips in the middle of February in Lake Ontario because that's going to be extremely difficult for kids. what we're often trying to find as part of the initial practicing is, in those kind of 2 to 4 ranges, about getting started, going up kind of that curve, being able to make it down the other side, and really reflect on some of the learning that comes from that. So again, going back to our example here, again, kind of that escape, the immediate anxiety dropping, feeling more comfortable. So again, turning this kind of curve into that green, so that we can, over time, find these curves where it's not that kids aren't necessarily feeling anxious or uncomfortable about it, but what we know is that over time, here we go, is that that anxiety tends to not last as long or is as intense in that moment. And that's really where some of that collaboration with parents and professionals can be really key to help kind of kids learn that, over time here, right, that worry monster is going to be getting smaller and smaller as we're doing that practicing. And that's often where I'm looking for other examples where kids have been able to manage some of those difficult or anxious feelings. I'm going to think about coming back to school even here in kind of September as part of that, how difficult those early, first day or two was about coming back with masks for a lot of us. And perhaps in some ways how maybe that's a little bit easier now, or for kids getting on the bus the first time, or roller coasters, or whatever types of examples where, boy, that felt really tough in the beginning, but with additional practice, how that felt more comfortable later on. And at the same time, how that avoidance is really going to make that worry monster much bigger. And if you have experiences of kids coming back from, Christmas break or March break or COVID break here, how that space and time away from school can really increase some of those feelings of anxiety. So I always kind of stop here a little bit just to kind of put a bit of the pause button, because I think the idea of exposure is really intuitive for a lot of us if we think about our own experiences. But I always have a bit of a caution here, because I think the tendency is often to run too fast and too hard, certainly in the beginning. So I have Professor Gallagher here and his controversial technique of confronting the fear of heights, snakes, and the dark, and that's what we call flooding. And I don't think that client's coming back anytime soon. And that's where, again, that collaboration can be really key for kids to figure out kind of that just right level, the right level of challenge so that they can be successful, and we can really reflect on their success and what a great job they did. So again, we're often trying to slow things down and break things down over time. So again, we're not in a situation here where that's a 10 or perhaps even higher for that client. So again, I really like that kind of 2 to 4 range when we're kind of getting started. I'd rather things be too easy, certainly than too difficult in the beginning. And what we're really looking for is, again, that experience of success, to talk about how difficult that felt perhaps kind of in the beginning, and how easier that feels afterwards with a lot of practice. So this is one example here, actually working with, this is a youth, actually this is the child who had kind of Mr. Freezy there as his worry. And he really had a difficult time with some kind of risk-taking worries in class. But one of the great things was I worked with his educator and the EA who was supporting that child, and we came up with his own kind of fear ladder, again, going back to the thermometer. So again, when I started working with him, he was able to already do a lot of things. So solving math questions, something he was really confident in, that's a 1 piece of cake, he could do that. At the same time, going up a little bit higher on that ladder on the thermometer there, reading a book, answering factual questions from the text, that was about a 3. And you can see up as we go up the ladder there, is that there's a great possibility about perhaps kind of being wrong. So 10, sharing his opinion about something in class. 9, putting his hand up in class. It was a factual answer, but it wasn't kind of checked by the teacher in advance, versus a 7 where it was kind of teacher checked. So again, what we're often trying to think about is brainstorming with the child, perhaps what does that exposure ladder kind of look like? How can we slowly go up this ladder over time to show worry that, hey, we can be successful, you can do it, and that we can kind of manage some of this discomfort. And when I kind of finished working with him, we were very much up to kind of the 7, 8, 9 range as part of that. He was really making some great gains because we were working as a team to really set up some of these different experiences with him. Just a graph here of kind of exposure in action for a youth that we were working with. So this was unplanned, so 8 was kind of too high. I usually wouldn't be advocating that, but this was just happened out and about. So I think this one in particular was about being separated from his parents. I think he had spent a time over at the neighbors or something because there's something work related. And he really described, you know, in the beginning parts, boy, the first 10 minutes were kind of really difficult. After about 15 minutes in, you know, it kind of flatlined there. It kind of, you know, anxiety grew old. Anxiety was kind of calling its own shot, saying all those kind of similar things that we know. You can't handle it. Parents are gone. Geez, you know, I've heard this before. And this was a great unplanned exposure and opportunity for him to learn from. That again, kind of, you know, 15 minutes in, that this is going to be uncomfortable, but that eventually I'll be able to manage. And that's really that experience we're kind of looking for kids, that over time, building that confidence and building that new learning that that anxiety is not as being as truthful as it says, and that we can manage it and be successful. So this is really leading a little bit, just as we're kind of wrapping up kind of the end here, about really the idea of kind of community and being able to wrap around, building some of those supportive, knowledgeable adults. It really does kind of take a village. I think it takes a village at the best of times, but especially with anxious kids, to intentionally find some of those situations and skills that we can help kind of build up. To be open to sharing knowledge and strategies across settings, across educators, perhaps it's a child using kind of rotary, going from one teacher to the next. And to be having kind of that long view here is that, you know, we're playing the long game here. So we're really focusing on celebrating growth and success, about, you know, what's the next inch for this child? How far have we come? What have we kind of learned to date? That, hey, maybe anxiety isn't as scary as perhaps it kind of once was. And at the same time, if we can kind of find those inches and those baby steps in the classroom here to be able to kind of advocate for support and understanding, so whether it be some of the professional staff that might be available and connected to your schools, to be curious and building that empathy and understanding over time. You know, and sometimes that's a little bit easier for some of our kids who are quiet and more internalizing, and more difficult for some of the students who might be displaying more observable or challenging behaviors in response to anxiety. But for me, that's something, you know, if we can kind of take away, again, kind of a bit of a seed there about, I wonder if kind of anxiety might be playing a role with what I'm seeing in the students' reactions. So when we're thinking about, again, kind of the plans and kind of, I guess, kind of stepping into your classrooms and next steps and practica and placements, things like that, we know that for long-term management and of anxiety, it really does involve learning and having exposure to a whole range of different skills. And we talked a little bit about some of that, the realistic thinking that's very helpful. It's often a first step that I'm doing with kids to help support some of the behavior and exposure, that risk-taking, again, very intentional over time. And again, that this doesn't kind of fall on you, and again, it's not about turning educators into therapists, but again, how the idea of a coordinated, knowledgeable team can really make such a big difference. And that's some of our work of the Child and Youth Development Clinic that we've done for kids in our anxiety programs, is putting together some summaries that parents can share with educators to say, hey, here's some of the strategies that we've been working on in group. It'd be great if we could find some opportunities to work on these skills. Again, perhaps it's around presenting or risk-taking or helping make some of drop-offs a little bit easier. And really, it's some of that new learning, exposure over time that we really know will promote long-term resilience. For kids who are extremely anxious or anxious over time, we know that there's a high overlap or co-occurrence of depression along with anxiety. And one of the great things I love about this work is being able to see the confidence that comes from kids around the new learning. Because when we can open up that third door, carve that new path for kids around experiencing the world in a different way, it really does. You can see the confidence that comes from doing difficult things there. right? And if we think about our own experiences here, where over time, where we've been really proud about something we've done, it's often been quite challenging, right? Perhaps it's been emotional, perhaps it's something we didn't think we'd be able to do, and that we've been able to do it. And that's the confidence piece that I love from kids being able to do some of this work, again, kind of over time. So I guess just kind of before we kind of wrap up here and perhaps have some time for questions, again, some great resources here that will be in the slides. School Mental Health Ontario, they've been putting together over time a whole rich set of resources. That activity there on realistic thinking came from the Everyday Mental Health Practices book, which I'd strongly encourage you to check out. Some great resources there. Anxiety Canada has some great videos and PDFs for caring adults, and kids. And if you're really interested in kind of learning more about this, Tamar Chansky has a great book there, really designed for parents, but could be any kind of caregiver or caring adult here, called Freeing Your Child from Anxiety. It's a great accessible text there, and she's got a great website, Worry-Wise Kids, and some other ones there. What to do when you worry too much, that's kind of a staple, and you might have seen. And Andy Green one is one for younger kids about not feeding that worry bug, right? Growing that anxiety over time, often because of some of that avoidance pieces. And just if you know a child or youth that might be struggling there, some different resources here in the London area, and family supports kids in kind of London, St. Thomas area, and some great books here as well related to kind of neurodiversity, mental health challenges that are great texts there for parents, caregivers, and some other ones there as well. Ross Green, Stuart Shanker, and a great one around social emotional learning and growth mindset, Your Fantastic Elastic Brain, which again shows just how some of the practice, flexibility over time can help grow some of those muscles. Yeah, so I think what I'll do is probably kind of wrap up there. Oh, just actually before I do that there, just if anyone's interested, I have a graduate student right now, Sydney Coleman. She's doing some focus groups with educators right now, really taking some of the ideas that we've shared here tonight and talking about, what might that look like in your classroom? What are the opportunities and challenges there? So this will be part of kind of the slide deck. And we're passing along some Amazon cards as part of that too. So if you're interested, give Sydney an email there, scolem5@uwo.ca. Yeah, thank you so much for letting me join tonight. And yeah, just curious about some questions there as well.
Yeah, so attendees, feel free to send in any questions. I know that we have this one, Colin, from Aaron, and I know you touched on it a little bit, but do you have anything to add to Aaron's question? What are your thoughts of the principles of ACT when it comes to informed practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So ACT really refers to a bit of a different therapeutic modalities. We have CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. ACT is the acronym of acceptance and commitment therapy. So that's really the idea of, rather than almost fighting against these kind of symptoms of anxiety, is that we're kind of accepting of them and validating and knowing that they're there as part of our experience. And even though we're feeling anxious, that we can go ahead and do things that are important and meaningful to us. So I think that's a great kind of complement. I use ACT a lot with adolescents. And I should have kind of prefaced this talk here about anxiety. It's not about turning anxiety on and off. It's like there's a light switch or a fix that way. It's always about dialing down the volume or the dial that way. I'm always telling kids, what would be different if we could turn that anxiety from a 7 or 8 to a 4 or 5 or a 3 or 4? What would be just part of your world or the world of your parents? How would things be different? And so it's really that idea around kind of management, kind of long term. So I think for a lot of kids who've just been anxious almost from day one, going back to the temperament pieces, or they're still kind of really struggling, I think that ACT perspective of being accepting of those feelings, inviting them in, and still being able to persist with some of the things that are important to us or that we want to do are a wonderful complement to that. So yeah, and I think it really is working in some ways around some of the behavioral pieces about still doing some of the things that are important to us, even though we're not perhaps kind of feeling totally comfortable around that. Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that's a great way of encouraging all of us. I think a number of educators I know who really normalize that experience. Perhaps kind of through, EQA was the first one that comes to mind on my end, but really talked about it as a group of, hey, we're all feeling uncomfortable, a little bit on edge, that's okay. We're going to do some deep breathing. We're going to go through this kind of experience together too. So, we can do difficult things even though we're not entirely feeling comfortable around that.
Awesome.
Great question.
So I'll ask you, we don't have any other questions, but I'll ask you my question I ask all the speakers.
Yeah.
So if I was going into my first day of teaching tomorrow, what would you tell me?
Yeah, no, geez, that's kind of $1 million question here, isn't it? Geez, that's a great question. I would say to, I think for the experiences, as a first day, about the experiences that we're feeling, perhaps a little on edge or uncomfortable, I would say that those feelings are very much kind of there in the classroom as well. And that there's some really interesting conversations that can come out about acknowledging the emotions and the feelings kind of in the room. So rather than trying to kind of bury that or pretend it's not there, but to actually kind of talk about what that's like, perhaps coming back to school or dealing with things that are different, can really promote just a whole range of different opportunities from that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Colin, so much. That was amazing. Thank you, attendees, for participating. Make sure that you go to the online teacher website and look at the next events. We have an event tomorrow night at 7 about differentiation, and we have another event next week about accommodating and modifying in online learning. So make sure you go check those out. Thank you all very much, and thank you so much, Colin.
Not a problem. No, and there's some again, if you're looking for some great resources there, School Mental Health Ontario in particular has put together a great toolkit talking about kind of the first 30 days coming back from coming back, but coming back to school in the midst of COVID, again, that are a great starting point. If you're going into the class there, and just how to invite some of those feelings and the social emotional learning opportunities there. So thanks so much, Anna, and to everyone for being here tonight.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Have a good night.
Great.